Welcome back to Mrs. Kate's YouTube channel. In this lecture, we will be reviewing some important information about invasive species in the Great Lakes ecosystem. As you watch, please fill in your guided notes on pages 32 and 33 in your workbook. Remember, all items in red go in the blanks. This is easy, but please make sure you're paying attention during the lecture. You will receive a homework quiz during the next class to check how well you understood this material, so please pay attention. In class, we have been looking at what the Great Lakes were like in 1969. We saw that in general, the lakes were really polluted. The Cuyahoga River was so dirty that it caught on fire. Ducks were choking on pollution in the Detroit River. Algae were growing heavily in Lake Erie. And DDT was entering the food chain and hurting eagle populations. We also learned about the different types of pollution. We said that there were two types: point source and non-point source. Point source pollution is pollution that has come from a single place. Really, anything that comes from a single pipe is considered point source pollution. So, for example, chemicals being dumped into the Great Lakes from a water treatment factory would come from a pipe and enter the Great Lakes. Since this is from a single place, it is considered point source pollution. Remember, pipe equals point source. The second type of pollution is non-point source pollution. This is pollution that does not come from a single place. Instead, it comes from many places. Air pollution from cars is like this. Think of all those cars driving around on the road, and they're all polluting. In this case, air pollution is coming from many places. We also talked about how rainwater sometimes doesn't sink into the ground, but flows over the ground. This is called runoff. As it flows, runoff carries chemicals through the watershed. So runoff is another example of non-point source pollution. And remember, we said that as we're trying to prevent pollution and clean up pollution, it's a lot harder to clean up non-point source pollution than it is to stop pollution from coming from a single pipe. So what happened to the Great Lakes after 1969? Were they still polluted? Well, one good thing was that people cleaned up the algae. The government passed laws that said that phosphorus could no longer be used in laundry detergent, and this helped a lot. Once the algae went back to normal, mayflies, these tiny little insects at the bottom of the food chain, were also able to go back to normal. Another good thing that happened was that the bald eagle made a comeback. Remember the problem? People were using DDT, which traveled through the food chain, into the water, through the fish, into the eagle. And then when the eagle ate the fish with DDT in them, the eagle got the DDT. Then the eagle had babies, and the baby shells were thin and weak. This caused them to hatch early, and many times the little eaglets died. From this chart, you can see that in 1976, the number of bald eagle nests was very low. But the government passed laws saying that farmers could no longer use DDT. With DDT no longer in the ecosystem, bald eagles were able to make a comeback. By 2006, you can see that the number of eagle nests dramatically increased. Another good thing is that PCB numbers have decreased. If you remember, PCBs were these terrible toxic chemicals that made people and animals very sick. In this picture, you can see that the beak on this baby bird is crossed. And in this picture, we saw how fish had cancer. You can see this one has cancer in its mouth. Gross. The problem for people was that the PCBs were passing through the food chain because people were eating the fish with PCBs in them without even knowing it. Would you want to eat fish with cancer? Not me, no thanks. But people were, and this was causing learning and memory problems. So again, the government stepped in and said no more PCBs. Car makers had to stop using them. And we can see in this chart that the number of PCBs went from very high to being quite low. This is a good thing. But still, it hasn't gotten down to zero. There are still some chemicals. As you can see from this chart, people are still being told not to eat certain fish. In particular, carp and catfish, these are the ones that we should never eat. So all of these things, algae, DDT, PCBs, this is where improvements were made. But there are still some continuing challenges. We saw that acid rain is still causing problems. We'll talk more about acid rain in our next chapter. We also saw that runoff from toxic waste dumps was still a problem. This runoff caused sediment to become contaminated or filled with toxic chemicals. In this graph, you can see that large amounts of toxic sediment are being removed. And that's a good thing. We don't want toxic sediment in our Great Lakes. But still, isn't it bad that they keep having to remove more and more of this toxic sediment? I mean, how much is there? And when will they be able to stop? So what about the other problems in the Great Lakes in 1969? What about invasive species? In this lecture, we'll be looking to achieve 3 objectives. First, after watching this lecture, you will be able to describe the impact of invasive species on the Great Lakes ecosystem. In other words, if invasive species are coming into the lakes, what are the effects? Are plants and animals being hurt? Are people being hurt? Second, you'll be able to describe how people tried to solve the problems of invasive species in the Great Lakes ecosystem. In our pollution lecture, we saw how the government stepped in to create new laws banning pollution. Will they use the same strategy here? Or will they have to try a different strategy? You'll be able to answer these questions after watching this lecture. Finally, you'll be able to describe the continuing challenges that still face the Great Lakes ecosystem. Even though things are a lot better today, there are still many problems with invasive species. After watching this lecture, you'll be able to describe what some of these problems still are. So let's begin. First, what is an invasive species? Invasive species are plants and animals that come into an ecosystem from somewhere else and cause harm to the ecosystem. It is important that this definition has 2 parts. If a plant or animal comes into the ecosystem from somewhere else, but it doesn't hurt the ecosystem, then it's not an invasive species. Similarly, if a plant or animal that is native to an ecosystem is causing harm, like sharks, for example, this is not an invasive species. That species belongs there. So to be an invasive species, it has to meet both parts of this definition. It's a plant or an animal that has come into an ecosystem from somewhere else, and it's causing harm to the ecosystem. Let's look at this first part of the definition. Invasive species come into an ecosystem from somewhere else. So where are they coming from? How do invasive species enter the ecosystem? The first way is through canals. A canal is a waterway that people have built to allow ships to travel from one place to another. You can see a picture of the Welland Canal here. Through this canal, ships can travel all the way from the Atlantic Ocean. On this map, you can see how the Welland Canal connects Lake Ontario to Lake Erie. Invasive species use these canals to travel from one place to another. In this case, they could swim from Lake Ontario to Lake Erie. You can imagine another canal that would connect Lake Ontario to the Atlantic Ocean. In this way, a new invasive species could travel all the way from the Atlantic Ocean into Lake Erie. A second way for invasive species to arrive is to come in the ballast water of ships. It may seem strange, but in order for ships to stay afloat, they have to fill up with a little bit of water at the bottom. This allows them to sit lower in the water and not to tip over. Before a ship leaves its port, it will fill up with ballast water. Then, when it arrives, it will dump that water. If there was a small species that was in the water, for example a zebra mussel, it would travel with the ship going from one place to another. So this is another way that invasive species can enter a new ecosystem. A third way is that invasive species can attach to the bottom of ships. This picture shows you zebra mussels on a ship. Here's another picture. Zebra mussels are tiny little creatures inside these shells. To travel, they latch onto the ship, and then they go with it wherever it's going. When it arrives, the zebra mussels detach and are now living in a new environment, a new ecosystem. This graph can help us understand what is happening with invasive species in the Great Lakes. We want to answer the question, based on the graph, describe the recent patterns in new invasive species numbers. In other words, are new invasive species increasing, decreasing, or staying the same? To answer this question, let's look at some specific examples. Let's first practice reading this graph. During the period from 1961 to 1980, how many new invertebrates were introduced? An invertebrate is an animal that doesn't have a spine, like a snake. So how many were coming into the Great Lakes? How many new invertebrates were being introduced? Take a minute and look at the graph. See if you can figure this one out. You can pause the video if you'd like. Did you figure it out? If not, let me show you how I would answer this question. First, I'm going to go to the time that the question is talking about, from 1961 to 1980. Here, I can see that there are three colors, blue, dark purple, and light purple. Which one do I look at? According to my key, I can see that invertebrates are symbolized by dark purple. So this is the block that I want to look at. And I want to know how many new species entered in. So I move over to the left-hand side where it says number of new species introduced. And if I draw some lines, I can see that invertebrates start at about 22 and then go up to 28. The difference between 22 and 28 is 6. So the answer is 6. Between 1961 and 1980, 6 new invertebrate invasive species were introduced into the Great Lakes. Let me ask another question. From the 1960s to the 1990s, did the number of new invasive plant species increase, decrease, or stay the same? Take a minute and try and answer this question. You can pause the video if you'd like. Did you figure it out? If not, let me show you how I would answer this question. First, look at the timing. Compare the chart from 1961 to 1980, and then to 1981 to 2000. Again, you have 3 different colors. So which one should you be looking at? The question asked you about invasive plant species. So using the key here, you can see that plant species are blue. Now look at these 2 columns, here and here. Was there a change? Definitely. Between 1961 and 1980, there were about 22 new invasive plant species. From 1981 to 2000, there were only about 2. So the number of new invasive plant species definitely decreased. Circle the correct answer in your workbook. Let's do one more. In general, in recent years, has the introduction of new invasive species increased, decreased, or stayed the same? So whereas the last question asked about plants, this one is asking about all types of invasive species. Take a minute and try and answer this question. You can pause the video if you'd like. Did you figure it out? I hope so. If not, let me show you how I would answer this question. Again, let's look at the timing. The question says in recent years. I would say that recent refers to the time after 1960. That's within the last 50 years. Before 1960, it was quite a long time ago. So just like the last question, compare the chart from 1961 to 1980, with 1981 to 2000. Again, you have 3 different colors. Which one should you look at? The question asked you about all invasive plant species, so you want to look at all the colors combined. So now you're looking at these 2 columns, here and here. Was there a change? Definitely. Between 1961 and 1980, there were about 35 new invasive species. And from 1981 to 2000, there were only about 20. So the number of new invasive species definitely decreased. Circle the correct answer in your workbook. Now let's go back to the original question. Based on the graph, describe the recent patterns in new invasive species numbers. Take a minute and write the answer to this question in the margin of your workbook. You can pause the video if you'd like. During our next class, you will be reviewing some evidence to determine what the Great Lakes are like today. In your groups, you will review 3 documents that look like this. Now these are different from the last ones you looked at. The last ones were dealing with pollution. These ones are now dealing with invasive species. Each one has a lot of information about invasive species in the Great Lakes. As you review the evidence, you'll be trying to answer the question, how do invasive species harm the Great Lakes ecosystem? Remember, as a booster, you'll be trying to explain that the problem of invasive species is getting better. As a doomer, you'll be trying to explain that there is still a significant problem with invasive species. You'll be using this information when you do your debate next week. Before you begin your classwork, it will be helpful to have some additional information. In this lecture, we will discuss 4 invasive species: the zebra mussel, the sea lamprey, the alewife, and the Asian carp. First, the zebra mussel. Zebra mussels are tiny little sea creatures that live in tiny shells. They arrive to the Great Lakes by attaching onto the bottom of ships and being in the ballast water of the ships. So we want to know, how do zebra mussels harm the Great Lakes ecosystem? First, zebra mussels steal food from the fish and animals that normally live in the Great Lakes. Zebra mussels are very hungry eaters. They eat small bits in the water like algae and phytoplankton. This is good because it cleans the water, but it's bad because it takes food away from the fish that normally eat this food. Another bad thing is that they clog water pipes. Zebra mussels grow very fast. Very quickly, they can clog up pipes and cause lots of problems for people. Finally, zebra mussels attach to the docks and make swimming dangerous for people. This is because they're sharp. So if you're swimming in Lake Michigan, you might brush up against a group of zebra mussels and cut yourself. This isn't a major problem for the ecosystem, but it's still a problem for people. Since the 1960s, things have gotten better in the Great Lakes. In 1969, zebra mussels were stealing food from native fish, clogging pipes, and making swimming dangerous. So the government took action. The governments of the US and Canada passed laws that said that shippers had to be careful. They had to be careful about their ballast water, and they had to be careful about zebra mussels being attached to the outside of their ships. This caused a pretty good change. Zebra mussels, the population decreased in number, and the effect was that the Great Lakes ecosystem was able to return to normal. Now let's talk about a second invasive species, the sea lamprey. How do sea lampreys harm the Great Lakes ecosystem? Well, first, it is helpful to understand what they are. Sea lampreys look like this. They are parasites that suck the blood from fish. In this picture, you can see how the sea lamprey is attached to this poor lake trout. Being a parasite means that the sea lamprey is an organism that lives off another organism. So in this case, the sea lamprey lives off the fish in the Great Lakes, specifically the lake trout. In this picture, you can see the place where the sea lamprey was sucking out the fish's blood like a vampire. Pretty gross, huh? By killing fish, sea lampreys cause harm to the Great Lakes ecosystem. Since fish were dying, this was certainly harmful for the whole food chain. Let's look at another graph to help us understand what's going on. Based on the graph, we want to describe the relationship between the sea lamprey and the lake trout. Take a moment to look at this graph and understand what it means. You can pause the video if you'd like. The title of the graph is Trout and Sea Lampreys in Lake Superior. On the left-hand side, the graph is showing us the percentage of historic average abundance. This is a very complicated way of saying how many there are of each different species, how many sea lampreys, and how many lake trout. On the bottom, the graph shows us time, going from 1930 to 1990. There are two important points in time labeled. Between 1930 and 1940, sea lampreys first entered into the Lake Superior ecosystem. And between 1950 and 1960, people first started to control sea lampreys. You will also notice that the sea lamprey is shown in red and that the lake trout is shown in blue. This helps us to think about it too. Blue is the good one and red is the bad one. So to help us answer this question, let's try and figure out how to write this statement. As sea lamprey numbers increase or decrease, trout numbers increase or decrease. Which way should we write it? Looking at our chart, we can see that in the beginning, sea lamprey numbers were increasing. This shows you how sea lampreys started from 0 when they first started coming in, and how very quickly their numbers went very high. At the same time, you can see that the lake trout numbers were decreasing. So this helps us answer our question. As sea lamprey numbers increase, trout numbers decrease. Now let's look at this question in another way. Starting in the 1950s, people first started to control sea lampreys. Because of new strategies and regulations, sea lamprey numbers decreased. Since the trout didn't have sea lampreys swimming around all the time trying to suck their blood, their numbers were able to increase. So this helps us answer our question in another way. As sea lamprey numbers decrease, trout numbers increase. So what is the relationship between the sea lamprey and the lake trout? Summarize your answer to this question in your workbook. You can pause this video to give yourself time to write. So what was happening to the sea lamprey? Well, in 1969, sea lampreys were killing lake trout and causing trout numbers to decrease rapidly. But as we saw in our graph, it didn't stay that way. People started to use chemicals to decrease their numbers, and they built dams to prevent more sea lampreys from entering the Great Lakes ecosystem. Up here in the top right corner, you can see a picture of a dam. This caused a major change. Sea lamprey numbers decreased. And the effect, as we saw in the graph, was that trout populations returned to normal. The next invasive species that we're going to look at is the alewife fish. we want to know, how does the alewife fish harm the Great Lakes ecosystem? The alewife is a small freshwater fish that has entered the Great Lakes ecosystem. They were very harmful because these fish have very large appetites. They're hungry eaters. They steal food from fish that normally live in the Great Lakes, making it difficult for them to survive. But it didn't stay this way. In 1969, the alewife was stealing food from native fish. So the government introduced a good fish, the Pacific salmon, to eat this alewife fish. As a result, there was a change. Alewife numbers decreased. And the effect was that fish populations were able to return to normal. So in sum, we've looked at 3 invasive species so far: the zebra mussel, the sea lamprey, and the alewife. Each of these was causing problems, but each of these invasive species was dealt with by people and by government laws. A lot of these problems have been solved. So now I just want to talk about one main continuing challenge with invasive species. I promise our lecture is almost over. I know it's been a really long video. The 4th invasive species is the Asian carp. And the Asian carp is still a problem. Asian carp are problematic because they consume large amounts of plankton. This disrupts the food chain. They also reproduce very quickly. So even though they've been banned, they're still very much a problem. Right now, I'd like to show you a video of what the Asian carp looks like. I hope you can see this.
Well, the reason they're jumping so much is they actually, when they are feeding, they're real close to the top of the water, surface of the water, within about a foot of the surface. So when you're driving by, the boat motor noise, the rush of the water may just agitate them, get them nervous, and they just come jumping out.
Dear Lord.
Okay, that's all I'll show you. I just wanted you to see how funny looking they were as they were driving up the river and being disturbed. So, just to go back to our PowerPoint very quickly. So, that's the problem with the Asian carp. And actually, this concludes our lecture. So thank you for watching Mrs. Kate's YouTube channel again, and for doing your homework. As always, this will make your next geography class much easier. If you have any questions, please write them down and bring them with you to your next class. Bye-bye.